I've been playing Dark Souls 2 for a totally reasonable amount of time now, and I've finally beaten the game. Dark Souls 2, I felt as an outsider looking into the game, has this reputation for being the absolute worst Souls game. A bad game, a lot of people have called it. After finishing the game, I just can't agree that Dark Souls 2 is actually a bad game, and before I go down the rabbit hole and brainwash myself into thinking that Dark Souls 2 is a bad game, I want to give you guys my honest impressions of it. Let's start with the familiarity that I have with the Souls games, because before you hear me ramble about this shit, you're probably going to want to know like my experience, my resume, if you will. I don't actually have 700 hours on my character, by the way. I just let my console run for a couple months without realizing it. About 10 years ago, my friend came up to me and said, "Hey dude, play Bloodborne, it's sick." So I went to the store, bought it, and had everyone's first experience with the Souls game. I died a lot and threw my console right out the frickin' window, never to be played again. Then, maybe 5 years ago, I was this live streaming streamer guy, and one of my 4 viewers was like, "Hey dude, you should totally play Dark Souls." And I was like, alright, I'll try that again. And I went and bought Dark Souls Remastered and tried a Souls game again. This time around, I also had the Souls experience. I got my ass kicked, I died a lot, and I was not having a good time until I was having a good time and fell in love with the game and just got good.
Die! Die! Let's go! Let's go! Let's go! Let's go! God! 293 deaths, I fucking did it! I beat this fucking game!
I just loved that gameplay loop of discovering a new area and then learning how to traverse that new area and then deal with the enemy placements. And then even if like this weak little ass dude kills you in the game, you still took some knowledge in, so the next time you go through, you're going to be better. And I just love that like building block concept that the game has going on. Eventually you conquer that area and you find the boss, and then you have a whole new set of challenges to overcome. I love that there was no difficulty settings in this game and that you were just either good enough to progress or you weren't. Games really don't, or at least for a long time didn't do that for accessibility reasons. But no, fuck that. Good on you, FromSoft. My dad thought that games were for little babies, all right? This game isn't for little babies. We don't make games for little babies anymore. My dad couldn't even beat Pinwheel. Are you gonna listen to him or me? Dark Souls as a concept is for me. I love overcoming a challenge for a little bit of dopamine in a hard video game. In fact, I even kind of handicap myself in these games in the way that I play. Like, I never reverse my hollowing. I just view my health bar as 50% or 75% of what it should actually be all the time. I've never summoned an NPC or a player, ever. I just do every single piece of content solo. I never look up walkthroughs for the areas before I go through them because I just love to play these games blind. They're so fun and immersive that way. I also complete every single boss that the game has to offer on my first playthrough, even the optional ones if it's possible. After completing Dark Souls Remastered, I got Demon Souls as a launch title with my PS5, and I beat that as well, following all of those exact same rules. Then the time came. It was time for me to play the game that everyone considered to be the worst Souls game, Dark Souls 2. In fact, the same friend that turned me on to Bloodborne like 10 years ago told me I should probably skip Dark Souls 2 and just go straight to Dark Souls 3 because that game is magnificent, but I told him no. I will suffer through as if I didn't even know another Souls game existed after Dark Souls 2. I'm going to play the whole thing, beat the hell out of it, and make some content on it, just like I did on the first 2 games, except I don't stream anymore, so here I am making this video. And now is that time. Let's talk about why Dark Souls 2 truly is not a bad game. I actually began playing Dark Souls 2 like a year ago. It didn't take me a year to beat or anything, but it kind of just fell to the side, and I'll talk about that later. I was craving my next Souls experience, so I got in the car and drove out to my closest GameStop that actually had the game in stock, and of course that was 45 minutes away. I only do physical editions. I got that old man energy about me. But there was a real problem. They gave me this atrocious third-party case, and I don't play that shit. My final boss of Dark Souls 2 is going to be getting a real case for this thing. Anyways, yeah, a year ago I popped this sucker into my PS5 and got to it. Let's talk, first and foremost, about the gameplay of Dark Souls 2. I'm going to be doing a lot of comparisons to Dark Souls 1, and to a lesser extent, Demon Souls, as that's my only experience with Souls games, and clearly people think these previous games are better than Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2, if anything, improved a ton of the systems over Dark Souls 1. It is a sequel after all, so that's kind of to be expected. So there's plenty of quality of life improvements over the first game that you're going to start to notice like right after you start playing. The biggest one is obviously bonfire traversal. I mean, Jesus hecking Christ, that first half of Dark Souls 1 is a real gamer moment. It turns boys to men. If you can beat the first half of Dark Souls 1, I think you could probably play through any of these Souls games.
This idiot YouTuber did not even realize that he was currently in the process of testing this theory without realizing it.
I'm also not complaining about 4 ring slots because I have at least 8 fingers, so that makes sense. It might have created a whole other balancing issue, but I'm not getting into that. I don't care. Managing equipment durability is so much nicer in Dark Souls 2, dude. No one wants to take your equipment somewhere to get fixed up. If the fire can cleanse me, it can cleanse my gear, damn it. The NPCs and vendors in the home hub area was something I value, but to be honest with you, my dumbass usually just uses whatever trash I be finding on the ground for most of the playthrough. I'm not the type to cheese an area or a boss. I've used a melee dex build on all 3 of my Souls playthroughs, and I pretty much just kill everything that I encounter with a katana or a greatsword, just whatever melee weapon I have. Occasionally, I might pull out those 50 random throwing knives I found on the ground 2 weeks ago to make an area a little easier if I'm really struggling, but overall, no cheese. I heard long before I ever played Dark Souls 2 that the biggest problem with this game is the amount of enemies, and the enemy placement in Dark Souls 2 is awful and unplayable and shit, you know, the not so nice things that people say on the internet. Knowing that, going into this game, I was really worried about my melee only, never pull out a bow unless legally required, weeb slicing, scythe slashing, and Chad greatsword wielding style might not be possible in this game. I was worried for no reason though, because whatever everyone's been complaining about in this game just genuinely did not bother me that much. I can name one time, and it's at Heidi's Tower of Flame near the start of the game where I struggled very hard because of the overwhelming amount of NPCs. I believe it had to do with me aggroing the NPCs by killing some bosses in a certain order, which sucks and I had no way of knowing, but like, isn't that Dark Souls? Being faced with choices that have consequences is kind of the whole thing. Did you see the end of the last game? If I gambled wrong on my adventure, then my adventure just got a little bit harder. And that's a bitch, I guess, right? But that's Dark Souls. You just get good and you overcome. Other than this one particular instance, there wasn't a single other time that I felt like I had a problem getting to an area's next bonfire or boss after fully clearing it out. In fact, I'd say my biggest complaint about Dark Souls 2 is that it's actually too easy. Because that's my biggest complaint, can I really complain about an overwhelming number of enemies in some areas? Souls games are hard. That's kind of why we fell in love with them, right? I like the lore too, but like, we need 3-hour video breakdowns on YouTube to understand what the fuck is going on. Like, this shit isn't well explained. We're all here for the difficult combat. What I'm trying to say is there's like 30 bosses in Dark Souls 2 that are far easier than what my experience was in a lot of the Dark Souls 1 boss fights. Some of that is just me getting better at the games over time. The longer I play the series, the better I will be at the game, but some of it is definitely the game in Dark Souls 2's case. Bosses like the Rotten are a joke, especially for how deep they are into the game. If you can get through the shit in Heidi's Tower in the early game, you're gonna smash that boss to pieces, so why complain about some of the few challenging parts of the game? Basically, sometimes the number of enemies in Dark Souls 2 is your knowledge check moment. How are you going to deal with the situation that the game has presented you and find a way to overcome? It is no different than any other experience you've had in a Souls game to this point. While explaining my thoughts, I understand why this is worse game design. I think we'd all prefer for the game to have the most challenging part of the game be the boss fights and not the areas between them. That's so much better for immersion's sake, and I fully agree with that. But don't complain about the path getting to the boss being difficult. Complain that the boss itself is way too freaking easy, because I was in awe of the amount of times that I first tried a boss in Dark Souls 2. I felt like the number of enemies is like the most controversial thing people talk about in this game, so I wanted to address it early, but because I brought up boss difficulty, let's talk about the bosses in the game. The game at a certain point felt a bit like a slog, just banging through the couple of bosses in each area, dying a few times, just exploring the new area, beating the next boss on the first try, and repeating it. However, there were a few challenges along the way, so let's talk about the few boss fights that were actually worthy of my attention. The Executioner's Chariot is a boss fight that really stuck out to me. I felt like this was the first time a boss fight felt more like a puzzle than it did a giant hollow monster trying to scalp me in the Souls series. I liked it. Rather than learning your dodge timings and your iframe timings, you were learning mechanics that were unusual to Souls games to this point, so it was unique and I was cool with it. I'm curious if other people loved or hated this boss, because I'm sure the feedback that players gave kinda shaped how they designed bosses in the future, since this one was so unique. The Pursuer fight was definitely a knowledge check of timings, and I took quite a few L's the first time I faced him. Thankfully, I learned to parry in the last Dark Souls game, so I was able to take him out eventually easy enough. If this was my first Dark Souls game, though, I really think this would have been one of those hard learning curves to get over. The Pursuer just doesn't fuck around. The Smelter Demon was the first time I started getting that good old-fashioned Dark Souls rage brewing deep within my own soul, as I missed my roll timings against this fucking guy about 1,000,000 times. To this point in the game, I had felt like every previous boss's roll timings were like pretty predictable, but the Smelter Demon, man, it was a real Dark Souls moment for me. Of course, though, when I finally beat that bitch, dude, I got that feeling, that rush that I got so many times of Dark Souls 1, that dopamine rush of just overcoming something hard. God, I love it. After Smelter Demon, I really didn't find a single boss past this point in the game to be notable up until the very end of the game, which I want to talk about the ending of a game in a separate little section, so I'm going to hold on to that bit for now. Let's talk about the different areas or levels in Dark Souls 2. What I learned in my first Souls game is that if I'm playing in a castle or a village or anything that kind of resembles normalcy of a world that's passed by, I will enjoy that content. If the game is taking place in the sewer or the middle of the woods or somewhere I literally cannot see, I will not enjoy it.
You've seen it here first on Kadai Gaming's YouTube channel. That is a shitfall, boys.
Dark Souls had Blight Town and Sen's Fortress, and my least favorite, the Tomb of Giants. I mean, honest to God, why would they make the game just pitch black? That's so fucking stupid. Demon Souls also had a sewer area that I despised, and Dark Souls 2 is no different. There's two areas in particular that I cannot stand in Dark Souls 2, and that is the Gutter and Black Gulch. Considering I also don't like Tomb of Giants, I think it makes sense that the darkest areas of Dark Souls 2 are my least favorite. In case you're wondering, I don't believe in torches. You can go into my man Tittle's save file here, and he didn't light a single goddamn torch in all of the Gutter, not even one. It's still unlit, and he likes it that way, and it's gonna stay that way. Bad areas in the Souls game don't ruin it for me. It actually immerses me into the world I'm in. If you were a knight or a wizard or whatever the hell you are trying to defeat all these hollow guys all the time, wouldn't you rather be in nice castles or more modern areas than a literal sewer? It's immersive, and immersion is something I value a lot in Dark Souls. You have to overcome bosses, the number of enemies, but also your environment. While I did enjoy some environments from an aesthetic standpoint, something that really bothered me about the game's areas was the linear progression. I'm gonna explain this by like drawing in paint or something back here. In Dark Souls 2, you unlock Majula at the start of the game, the home hub area, and I like it. It's quaint and the music is a spooky little vibe. Branching out of Majula, there's a few different paths you can take, just like Firelink Shrine from Dark Souls 1. What bothered me is each of these paths would unlock a few bonfires along the way and eventually lead you to a dead end, expecting you to teleport back to Majula and go down a new path. Dark Souls 1 masterfully made it so when you complete a few of the areas in the game, it would lead you back to Firelink Shrine, doing something I would call circular progression. I think the Souls games are perfect with a circular progression concept. I loved unlocking a shortcut that was seemingly in the middle of nowhere and then suddenly being back at Firelink Shrine because it made the world feel so much more immersive and alive. There's still some dead ends in Dark Souls 1, but overall the world feels more fleshed out and thought out. I'd say the lack of circular progression is my second least liked thing about Dark Souls 2 behind the game being so much easier than the first game. Dark Souls 1's map and areas also felt like it had the perfect world size with the perfect amount of verticality built in, whereas Dark Souls 2 feels like a giant one-level map. It also feels giant because I think that Dark Souls 2 might just be too long of a game. Earlier I mentioned that at some point the game just kind of feels like a slog of clearing areas and one-shotting bosses, and I never had that feeling in Dark Souls 1 or Demon Souls. Never once did those games feel like slogs. Halfway through this game, actually right when I got to the Gutter, I decided I don't want to play this game anymore. Well, it was more of a subconscious decision, but I stopped playing. Other things happened in life and I just started playing other stuff and whatever. Eventually, I always think to myself though, wow, I'd love to play Elden Ring. And then I remember that I've committed myself to playing all the FromSoft games in order, starting with Demon Souls. Well, kind of. I actually started with Dark Souls 1, but from now on, we're going in order, damn it. My point is that this game is a little too long, and I think that in the amount of time it took me to get to the Gutter, I had probably already beaten Dark Souls 1. At least mentally, that's how it felt. I've been shit-talking this game a fair bit, and I know that the title of this video is that Dark Souls 2 is actually a good game, and it is. I'm just being critical about the things that I didn't like about it, and I'll continue to elaborate on some of the positives as I go on. Speaking of positives, I want to talk about the DLC a little bit. Obviously, playing this game in 2024 and 2023, I'm playing on Scholar of the First Sin, which includes all of the 3 DLCs that came out with Dark Souls 2. I can't even begin to comment on the Dark Souls 2 base release. I mean, that shit's lost to time to me, so I hope you weren't thinking that that's what I've been talking about this entire time. Anyway, the way I progressed through the game was by playing the main game all the way up until the point where you can enter the Throne of Want, and then I decided to play the DLCs. I did kill the optional Ancient Dragon, and that was a great boss fight, by the way. I didn't mention it earlier because I'm kind of at the point now where I do want to start talking about the end game, but my god, was it so underwhelming to finally fight Vendrick or what? They really built that one up. The Ancient Dragon fight was much, much harder. I nearly first tried Vendrick. The Ancient Dragon took me at least 10, I'd say. After killing Vendrick, I did the DLCs in the order of release, starting with the Crown of the Sunken King. The DLCs really made this game for me. The DLC made me glad I didn't just jump into Bloodborne or Dark Souls 3 next. I'm glad I came back and finished Dark Souls 2. There were some very challenging areas in the DLC, and not only were there challenging enemies in the DLC, but there were challenging bosses. Remember the linear progression feeling of paths and dead ends I talked about earlier within Dark Souls 2, and how I preferred the circular progression from Dark Souls 1? Well, guess what? The DLCs pretty much all have fantastic circular progression. I wish I was a fan of the game back in 2014, so I could know if a lot of these changes were just based on fan feedback and like the way that I felt playing through this game 10 years later. The DLCs literally took my least favorite things about the base game and fixed them, and for me that was fantastic and really changed my feelings on this whole game. The DLCs also did a great job of telling their own stories. I felt they did a way better job than Dark Souls 1 for sure, and a better job of the base game up until this point as well. I never played Dark Souls for the lore or the story, right? I just watch a YouTube video summarizing the damn games for me like a movie afterwards, and I'm fine just enjoying these games for the gameplay. The DLCs kind of flex that these games could grow in their storytellings. We don't need to find the lore by reading descriptions on items or other mundane shit. Throw it in our faces and make it skippable. No harm, no foul. In particular, I think the Crown of the Ivory Kings DLC did a fantastic job of forcing you to understand the lore of the area you were in based on the gameplay, which I think is a rarity for the Souls games. That DLC was actually my least favorite gameplay-wise because I had to run back and do everything over again after everything unfroze. Oh, and because it's home to the worst area in the entire game. While I overall love the DLCs and can deal with the awful areas that Dark Souls sometimes throws at you, I drew a line for the first time in all of the Souls games with Dark Souls 2. I cannot and will not complete the Frigid Outskirts. I don't think it's actually that difficult, and I know I could beat it, but I'm so sick of these areas where you cannot see anything. It's just so obnoxious to me, and after researching it a little bit, it looks like an area designed for summons or co-op or whatever, and I just wasn't interested. For the first time ever, I skipped an optional boss and area in Dark Souls. Credibility ruined. Whatever. Let's talk about the DLC bosses. Overall, the fights with Alana, Fume, Alone, and the Burnt Ivory King were all sick. FromSoft had a much higher hit rate with the boss success in the DLC than they did with the base game. All these fights felt fair, like I actually needed to learn the boss's moves and abilities to understand what the hell was going on before I'd ever have success. A lot of the other bosses in this game, you can just go up and have a whack at it, dude, and still win. There was one boss in these DLCs that gave me the challenge I was looking for, and that was the Blue Smelter Demon. Look, I took a giant break of playing in the middle of this game, so I did forget the original Smelter Demon's attacks and timings, but still, this boss took me literally 4 straight hours of gameplay to finally beat. When I beat that dude, I was doing laps around my house, something I haven't done since I beat a boss in Dark Souls 1 probably. I learned that the Blue Smelter Demon area was also designed for co-op, and everything I googled just said to use a summon or some range poison and run around cheese, but I don't do that shit. What this boss actually taught me is that Dark Souls 2 has a stat that changes your iframes, which wasn't in the first game. I played through this entire game to the point of Blue Smelter Demon not understanding that I needed to level in adaptability to increase my iframes. Think about how much I've been bitching about how easy this game was, and I was playing it severely handicapped. What the hell? Of course, by this point in the game, I'm so high leveled that getting some points into adaptability is basically impossible because I already have HP, Dex, and Endurance past 50 as I didn't realize I needed to level ADP. Oh well though, it is what it is. I really didn't struggle too bad on any bosses in this game except for old Blue Smelty. He really got me. That son of a bitch. Anyways, moving on. I loved the circular progression of the first DLC. I loved the bosses of the second DLC, and I loved the story and the lore of the third DLC. The gameplay of going back and rescuing those trapped knights to help you in the final boss fight is cool. It's way cooler than just summoning some random guy you met along the way. They actually serve a purpose in the lore, and I didn't mind these summons. I really liked it. I wouldn't mind more lore-heavy areas like this. I hope Dark Souls 3 is a baby of all of these things that I like in the DLC, but who knows if my opinion is even popular. I'm just excited to see others' opinions after this, to be honest with you. Overall, I'm not gonna rate the base game until the very end of this video, but I give the DLCs of Dark Souls 2 a solid 9 out of 10, which is exactly what I give Dark Souls Remastered. When I finally exited that last DLC and decided to move back to the base game to wrap things up, I was actually met with a feeling of sadness. Through most of this game, I was feeling, like I said earlier, stuck in some kind of slog, but the DLC areas reminded me of how good Souls games are and made me miss it a little bit, knowing that my journey would be over so soon. I made my long haul to the Throne of Want and started my final series of boss fights ever in Dark Souls 2. Remember how I said I beat a lot of the bosses on the first try? I actually beat the Watcher and Defender first try, which I feel like for a third to last boss who fights in the same room as the next two bosses, this fight needed to be harder, but nonetheless, we proceed. I didn't beat Nashandra on the first try, but after 2 or 3 tries, I realized her dumb gimmick was to put on some curse defense, and after I realized that, I beat her first try. Weak. Finally came the final boss of the game, Aldia. I was ready for a challenge. Aldia was a cool boss fight. The boss fight felt epic. Souls games always have this fantastic soundtrack that can get you hyped up even if you're just standing still beating the living hell out of the rotten. But Aldia was weak as well. After 2 or 3 fights of learning the attack styles, I was able to beat it. And I got within like 10% of their health on my first try. It felt unacceptable for an end of the game boss. But then the game gripped me one more time and actually faced me with the decision that I've been looking forward to redeeming since I finished my playthrough of Dark Souls 1. When I finished Dark Souls 1, I lit the bonfire in the room after I defeated Gwen. Because my monkey brain saw a bonfire and went, ooh, look, a bonfire, and I lit that shit. I didn't want that ending. I wanted to walk out like a badass. But I didn't. I had no way of knowing. Souls games, man. So punishing. The end of this game actually laid out your decision for you. Will you choose light or dark, good or evil, or something else entirely? Of course, I chose to leave this place. I've freed many, many hollow from their burden, fought evil, and I'm out. I loved the ending of Dark Souls 2. I felt a little sad when it finally wrapped up and I was faced with the realization that I actually had to write this entire video out now. I can't shit on Dark Souls 2. I can't say Dark Souls 2 is a bad game because it's not. If you compare Dark Souls 2 to Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 3 or any other Souls game, maybe you'd feel differently, but why would you compare them that way? Why not take the game for what it is? Treat it like a standalone title and it stands up, all on its own. Of course, if you start comparing game to game, there's always going to be a weak link, but to say you don't enjoy Dark Souls 2 as a person who likes Souls games is just crazy to me. So they put too many enemies on the map and you died in a Souls game? The horror! The audacity! How could they? Basically, if you think that Dark Souls 2 is bad, I think that you should get good. I think that Dark Souls 2 is a solid 8 out of 10. Of course, there's a ton of improvements that could have been made. I made a ton of criticisms of this game in this video alone, and I hope the sequel to this game is even better, and it sounds like it is. For now, though, I gotta head over to my next Souls game. If you watched this far into the video, man, I appreciate you. If you could just scroll down real quick, hit the like button, and even leave a comment, say anything you want, man, but it just helps push the video out to more people, and I would appreciate that. And that's all I got. So until next time, peace out.